to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Finding Species Thought to be Lost, presented by Eleanor Edye. Eleanor is joining us today from Erickson, a small town in central Manitoba. When she's not out working as a professional biologist, you can find her guiding NatHab trips in locations such as Churchill, Switzerland, and Quebec. Eleanor, we're honored to have you with us today. Thank you very much. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks so much for the lovely introduction. And yes, as he said, I am coming to you today from beautiful, sunny Manitoba, Canada. I live in a small town, but do guide elsewhere in the province as well as around the world. And I know that I can speak for a lot of our expedition leaders when I say that we're all really looking forward to getting back and welcoming so many of our guests back into the field. So today, what I wanted to talk about was a look at species that we thought were lost, thought to be extinct, that have since been refound. So this is a really broad topic. I'm not going to be talking about every single species that we thought was extinct and came back. What I really want to do is get into talking about how this happens, how we think species have gone extinct and they actually turn out not to be, and then come through some specific examples. And I also want to point out that one of our other ELs, Mike Hillman, did a webinar on the same topic back in November of 2020. So he did a fantastic job as well. And if you enjoyed it and you came here to hear new things, awesome. If you didn't know this and you enjoyed today's webinar, I hope you go back and give Mike's a listen as well. And that is findable at our website in the Daily Dose of Nature section. So like I said, I'm going to be talking about several particular species that I couldn't stop myself from just throwing in some pictures from things I was not going to be specifically talking about. And the image you can see right here is of a Somali Sanghi, which you can see is a small rodent, which was rediscovered just last year after 25 years of no sightings. The leader photo that you saw of those beautiful flowers was also a rediscovery in 2020. It's called the coral tree, and it was refound on the east coast of Africa just last year. So all very exciting news for those of us who love biodiversity. So if you saw Mike's webinar, or if you're coming to this brand new, you may have already heard of a term I'm going to use. And this is the term Lazarus Taxon. A Lazarus Taxon, or a Lazarus taxa, if we're talking about its plural, is a taxon that disappears for one or more periods in the fossil record, only to reappear again later with no visible changes. Now, a taxon, if you don't already know, refers to any level of taxonomy. So if I'm talking about a species, we could have a species that we knew of 30 million years ago that could be refound today, but we could also have a genus or a family or an order or even a larger grouping as well. So no matter what level of taxonomy we're talking about, we can say that that Lazarus taxon is one that had disappeared in the fossil record only to reappear again later. And if you were to visualize it, I love this image here. This is of Horseshoe Canyon in Alberta, Canada. It's an area that's well known for its fossil beds, and you can guess why just looking at it. If I were a paleontologist going down through these canyons, for example, if I found the bones of one particular dinosaur low down, and then I look up and up and up through all those layers, didn't find it, didn't find it, didn't find it, didn't find it. That might be a period representing millions of years, and then I refound those same organisms higher up. That would be an example of that Lazarus taxon. As you might have guessed, it is from the biblical Lazarus, so it refers to that organism that died and then rose from the dead, if we were to think about it that way. It's a term that's been around since the early 1980s. So if you haven't heard it before, that's okay, because it might not have been around last time you talked about this kind of stuff. So to give you an example of kind of what this might look like, and I know some of you are probably using small screens, so I'll point things out as we go here. If you look on the left-hand side, we have a group called Triblidia, and this is a particular group of mollusks that no longer exists, as far as we know. And if you were to look at this, so on the vertical scale here, we have millions of years, and we know that the Triblidia were found in the Middle Devonian, which was about 400 million years ago. And then we have this huge gap in the fossil record where they weren't seen again until only about 2.6 million years ago. So all that time in between, did they cease to exist? Well, I mean, no, right? Obviously they didn't, because they don't just disappear and come back in real life. If we were to go back 100 million years, 200 million years ago and do distinct surveys, in all likelihood, we would still be able to refine those species. But this is overwhelmingly an artifact of the fossil record. Most species that live on Earth, just like you and I and our dogs and our cats or anything else that's out there right now, isn't likely to fossilize. We think that the number of species out there in the fossil record only represents, at the most, about 1% of all the species that have ever lived. The fossilization is very uneven. It's organisms with hard body parts tend to fossilize more, but also just where an animal dies has a lot to do with whether or not it fossilizes. So the fact that we didn't see them for a period of nearly 400 million years doesn't mean that they didn't exist anymore. It just means that they were refound and that they were hard to find, or perhaps they were not as common throughout the world at that point. If you look at the right-hand side, we have another example. So this is the Therizinosaurids, one of my kids' favorite dinosaurs. They have giant claws on the front, so very popular toy. If you have little kids at home, I highly recommend picking up a Therizinosaurus for them to play with. Now, just to draw you in, like, as to how we know this. So this is another example of a Lazarus taxon. Was seen, we have here, around 200 million years ago, and then 127 million years ago. Only 2 instances are known, so huge gap in between those. And in fact, if we were to look into the fossil record itself, and we saw what the paleontologists saw, you would actually see that not only do we only have those couple of instances of that organism being known, that in fact, not even the whole organism fossilized. So the bones that you see in this image here are the only bones that we know of from this organism. So the vagaries and the inconsistency in the fossil record is primarily the reason, when we look at the far past, that we see these giant gaps. And we have these Lazarus taxa that disappear and then reappear over the time of the fossil record. But the fact that we have that uneven fossilization isn't necessarily the only reason why we have these Lazarus taxa that disappear and then reappear. And a really good explanation for this came in a paper in 1999 that really delved into the biology as well as the fossilization behind the reasons that Lazarus taxa exist. And I will use the words of the authors Wignall and Benton, because I think they were perfect. So we know that at the times of biotic crisis, so times when we've seen high levels of extinction, for example, at the time of the extinction of the dinosaurs, when asteroid hit the Earth, we would call that definitely a time of biotic crisis. So many taxa will go extinct then. But we also know that at those times, some might only temporarily disappear from the fossil record for millions of years before returning unchanged. So when we're looking at that fossil record, the fact that we don't see those species isn't necessarily just because they didn't fossilize well. We're also looking at the possibility that those taxa, those species or those families, actually became much less present on the Earth's surface. So, for example, if the Therizinosaurids, the fact that we only have a couple of examples of them in the fossil record, does that mean that, in fact, there were only very, very small populations, and that's why we only saw them occurring a couple of times? It might be because of the fossil record. It's impossible for us to say historically what the reasons would be, but we can certainly look at what we see happening on Earth currently and think about that, how that might play out in the future fossil record, or how it might apply to the fossil record that we can look at these days. So while Lazarus species or Lazarus taxa, the term was originally put in place to describe what happens in the fossil record. But it's really been brought into a larger conversation around conservation biology and ecology to refer to species or families or populations that were thought to be extinct and have been rediscovered. And this is often within like our lifetimes that these kinds of things have happened. So just to expand our minds even a little bit more, the species that we know have gone extinct is a small number of the total number of species. So this slide here is showing us how many species we have actually described in nature. So we know that as humans, we like to go out, we like to look at things, we like to categorize things, and we especially like to categorize big things like vertebrates. So we know that worldwide, there are around 5,500 species of mammals, and we have described most of them as far as we know. If you look at insects, there are many, many, many more, up into the billions in all likelihood, and we have described just a small fraction of those. So when we're talking about those Lazarus species, we tend to focus on things that we already knew about, that have already been described, because we do know that there are other ones that we, might disappear before we even know that they exist. We know that extinctions happen all the time, and they happen whether or not we are aware of them. Like I said, we tend to focus on those large charismatic species, but at all times in the fossil record and in geologic history, there's always been a background level of extinction. At various times, for many, many reasons, that rate can go up and it can go down. And we think that right now we are living at a time where that rate is likely higher than it has been for some time. So we do know that there are species on this planet that are being lost, that our grandchildren won't see. So this is one of those reasons that I wanted to talk about the good news stories, to talk about the things that are certainly still rare, but things that we thought had gone forever that in fact hadn't. I think that's fantastic. When we're talking about the reappearance of extinct species, we first have to think about, like, how do we even know if an organism is extinct? And to know about this, we really have to turn to the IUCN. The IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and they are kind of the last word in the conservation of species globally. They curate a list called the Red List, which is used by governments, industry, conservation planners to understand environmental impacts on any given species. The idea behind the Red List is that all species on Earth, eventually at least, will be looked at. If they are evaluated, they will be slotted into one of the categories that you can see here. Right now, because there are so many species, the IUCN has really been focusing on things like mammals, plants, fungi, as well as some arachnids and some crustaceans. So it's not all the species on Earth that make it to the list, but the ones that do make it on then go through a process of scientific evaluation. When they're evaluated, if it turns out that there simply isn't enough information, they get a stamp called data deficient. Just means that we don't know. There might be a whole bunch of them. There might not be. There simply isn't the data. If they're evaluated and found to have no major risks, they will either fall into one of these green or light green categories, so of least concern or near threatened. Those two categories are not considered to be in the a level of extinction risk. As we continue up that list, as we see vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered, these are organisms where they have been evaluated and they have been judged to have either a moderate, high, or very high risk of extinction in the near future. Now, unfortunately, this can of course progress to the point where a species becomes extinct. And extinction means that we think it doesn't exist anymore beyond a reasonable level of doubt. It means that people have gone out and looked for it. It means that there has been documented decline. It means that we know that risk factors exist and that we have waited an appropriate amount of time based on the lifespan of that organism to say, look, We don't think it's out there anymore. And an organism may be completely extinct, not found anywhere on the planet anymore, or it may just be extinct in the wild and still be found in places like zoos or in animal rescue organizations. And like I said, we do live in a time where a lot of species are threatened by extinction. So of all the species that the IUCN has assessed, nearly a third of them are in those top 3 categories. So either endangered, critically endangered, or vulnerable. So we're in a time where there are a lot of species facing concerns. Now, as we see those declines, as we see species becoming vulnerable or endangered or critically endangered, we're also likely going to have good news stories, right? Those species that we think have gone extinct but haven't. So there are sometimes those good news stories that balance out that background extinction that we can see, and it's all part of that wonderful circle of life. Now, let me tell you about how I decided what species I was going to be talking about today. The first one I want to talk about is one that Mike talked about during his webinar. So I'm not going to be going into as much detail of the story as he did, but last week I was working at a biological field station and I was surrounded by biologists, and I thought, who better to ask what species I should talk about? So I went to everybody and I said, hey, what's your favorite Lazarus species? And I was surprised for 2 reasons. One, because nearly everybody kind of looked at me like a deer in the headlights when they were put on the spot because they hadn't thought about this since their undergrad. And the second thing that I was surprised about was, regardless of whether somebody was a fish biologist or a bird biologist or a botanist, this was the one that almost everybody came up with. So the fish that you can see right now is the coelacanth. And if you know any story of a Lazarus species, it is probably this one. You might have heard about it in school, you might have heard about it in other readings. And if you're like me and you were casting your mind back to think about what kind of stories you heard about when you were taking biology, I remember being completely underwhelmed because all that we saw in our lecture was this picture of this very sad taxidermied fish. So I've at least given you a picture of a beautiful live specimen. And what I want to talk about is why this finding was so important and why your biology teacher may have talked about it and why this might be the only story of a Lazarus species that you personally know of. So quick story here. The woman you can see in this image is named Marjorie Courtney Latimer. And she is the woman who brought the attention of the world to the coelacanth back in 1938. So she was a museum official at the East London Museum in South Africa. She was a naturalist. She was particularly interested in unusual fish specimens, to the point where she actually contacted a bunch of local fishermen and said, give me a shout if anything odd ever turns up in your boat. So in December of 1938, she got one of these calls. She went out and looked at it and said, I don't know what the heck that is. So she hauled it back to the museum and used all the reference books she had at hand to try to ID it. Ultimately, she couldn't put an identification on it. So she had the fish taxidermied, transferred it to a colleague by the name of J.L.B. Smith, who taught at Rhodes University, who made the ultimate identification and actually gave it a name and named it after Marjorie Courtney Latimer. So the genus species name of the coelacanth is Latimeria chalumnae. Now, in terms of why we care about it, the coelacanth, before it was refound in 1938, had last been known to us only via fossil specimens. So it was not one that, we saw decline, we know it was lost. This had not been seen for 65 million years. Coelacanth belonged to the group called the lobe-finned fishes. So we're looking here at a cladogram, so an evolutionary tree that shows the relationships between groups. And the middle row there is the fishes, and you can see the one that really expands outwards like a dark blue cup. That is the ray fin fishes. If you think of a fish any fish aside from the coelacanth right now, that is the kind of fish you're going to be thinking about. All the fish that you know of, all the fish that you eat, these are all ray-finned fishes. And they last shared a common ancestor with the coelacanth back in the Silurian or Ordovician. So we're talking again around 400, 450 million years ago. Now, the lobe-finned fishes are that small line, second from the left, second from the right, and they still exist today. Obviously, we're talking about the coelacanth, but they didn't go on to radiate outwards like the ray-finned fishes did. But what they did do was actually spawn a separate lineage called the tetrapods that you can see over on the right-hand side. So the common ancestor of all amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, all of those things, the last common ancestor of all those took us all the way back to the time of those lobe-finned fishes. So it's been a very long time since humans and the coelacanth shared a common ancestor, but share it we did. Like, we are looking here at something very similar to what our very distant ancestors would have looked like. There are a few species that exist within that lobe-finned fishes group. So the coelacanth on the left-hand side there, they've actually found a second species. There are 2 species of living coelacanth, and then the other group of lobe-finned fishes are the lungfish, and there are 6 species of those. There are an incredible array of differences between these and the ray-finned fish, completely different anatomy, completely different physiology. They're fish because they swim in the water. Otherwise, they're very, very different. So just you couldn't get much different. And just to hammer that point home, if we have the ray-finned fish up at the top there, we have humans on the bottom, and you track it back down, we're going to get back to where that coelacanth was. So when the coelacanth was refound in 1938, it absolutely blew the mind of every biologist who was out there. And if we had an equivalent example to this right now, it would be like if you were out bird watching and happened to just find a pterodactyl. That is the equivalent of what we're talking about for this coelacanth. So there's a reason that it gets talked about so much as an example. It's best known of all the Lazarus taxa. We're talking a very, very long period of time that it's been lost to human knowledge. And they're still out there. So they are localized in small areas. So on the east coast of Africa primarily, and another population in Indonesia. We think they haven't been known to humans for so long because they are actually nocturnal. So they come out and they hunt at night, which makes them less likely to be seen by us. And they also reside pretty far deep in the ocean. So the shallowest sighting was at around 150 feet deep, but they mostly live between 500 and 1,500 feet down. So the scuba diver you can see in this image here is actually using a relatively new type of equipment called a rebreather that lets them go very, very deep down. But usually we're not talking about being able to access this kind of environment ourselves. Now, in terms of how the fish sits in its IUCN Red List ranking, it is still considered to be critically endangered because we have those small pockets of fish. They're not found in very large areas. They don't tend to be hunted by humans. They're not an economically attractive species. They're actually mostly taken as lab specimens more than anything else. But they have an incredibly slow reproductive rate, so they're very slow to replace themselves. In fact, and I asked a fish biologist about this because it completely blew my mind when I read this. They actually gestate their young within the female's body, and they have a 5-year gestation period. Imagine that. That's quite mind-blowing. Many, many mind-blowing things about these fish. All right, so that is our introductory species, the one that we probably have heard about, and now I want to start getting into some other ones. So the next taxon I want to talk about is the other one that the biologists actually came up with. So this is I actually get a chance here to talk about plants. We are looking at here the evolutionary scale of plants over the last 500 million years or so. So over time, we have had different pushes of plants that have come through. When plants first moved onto land, we had things like algae and mosses. As time went on, evolution did its thing, and we ended up with firstly ferns, and then later on things like cycads, ginkgos, conifers like pines and spruces. And then finally, around 150 million years ago or so, we had the evolution of angiosperms, or flowering plants. Each of these different groups represents a really big technological leap for plants. And each time there has been a big leap like that, other plant species have kind of been pushed to the side and either died out or gone into smaller regions. So things like liverworts, mosses, and algae, have a moss up here on the top left. They were fairly limited in where they could be distributed because they don't have any structural tissue. They're also reliant on water for fertilization. Ferns were kind of the next big group to come along, and they have vascular tissue, so they're able to get more robust and grow upright, but they are still reliant on water for fertilization. They still have sperm cells that swim. The next big stage of evolution gave us the conifers, and this was a really big leap, like mind-blowing in terms of what was happening in the plant world. If you have spring allergies, you already know this. Conifers produce pollen instead of sperm, and pollen doesn't need to swim. It just goes on the wind, or it goes on the back of a bee, or however it gets along. So it's now a little packet of pollen, and these organisms produce seeds instead of spores. The angiosperms, or the flowering plants, they look pretty to us. If you were a plant back around 150 million years ago, this would have been like developing the atomic bomb. We're talking a huge innovative leap for plants. And flowering plants have been so incredibly successful that other plants like the ferns, the conifers, the mosses, they've really been pushed into, more marginal habitats. They're still there. Many of them have gone extinct, but we know that these groups are still found. And if I were to take you back around 150 to 200 million years ago to the Jurassic, before the flowering plants came in, this is, a scene of what you might be looking at. You would probably recognize a lot of these plants, not necessarily the individual species, but the groups themselves, right? You could find the conifers, you could find the things that look like Christmas trees, you might find ginkgos or cycads, and which you might know if you're into gardening. And we would also be able to recognize them through the fossils that were laid down at this time. Now, plants are a bit of a different story when it comes to fossils. Animals, we tend to have the bones that get fossilized. Those hard structures are much more easy to fossilize than soft tissue structures. So with plants, you hardly ever get the whole plant. You often only get what's called an imprint fossil, so you see the bark or you see leaves. So just those superficial structures. More rarely, we get things like fossilized wood, or even fossilized like pine cones, where you can see the internal structures that have actually still been fossilized as well. So if you were a specialist looking at fossil plants, they tend actually not to be categorized as entire plants. They're given names based on the pieces of plants instead, because we're often not completely sure which pieces go together because they fossilize in different conditions. One of the groups of conifers that was very, very, very successful around this time is known as the Oricariaceae. So if you were walking in this area 200 million years ago, you would have members of this family all around you, all around the globe. Similar to, if I were to pick one family today that is distributed similarly, it would be the aster family. So we see daisies, we see dandelions, we see all of those composite flowers all over. They've gotten into every habitat. That was what the Oricariaceae was like back in the Jurassic. And we like them as biologists because they're also really easily defined in the fossil record. They have very particular structure of the leaves, and they also have very particular structure of the cones. So you can see that is a fossilized cone. female cone. It's got the seeds developing within it. And in fact, they had very, very, very large cones relative to other organisms within the conifers. We saw things like this, so imprint fossils of the leaves, and this fossil is again from that time zone, so around 175 million years ago. Now, this group does still exist today as a shadow of its former glory. So about 41 species of this family still remain in the world today. Again, this group used to cover the world with thousands upon thousands of species. These days, they are found naturally in the southern hemisphere, as well as some notable ornamentals. So you may have one of these in your house right now. This is a Norfolk pine. So it comes from Norfolk Island off the coast of Australia. And most of us who grow them in our houses, they kind of look sad and small like this. But if you were to look at one in nature, they do actually get really, really big and beautiful. And I just had to include this because most of us have only ever seen them as sad, small houseplants. They do actually get quite large and majestic. Another species that you might be aware of is the Oricaria Oricana, which is also called the monkey puzzle tree. It's a common ornamental in certain areas where it's warm enough. It's a beautiful tree. It's found naturally in Chile and Argentina. And it's, you can see it's got very similar leaf structure to what we saw in those fossilized species as well. Now, this is again the monkey puzzle tree coming up in our next slide. And you can see that those cones are very, very, very predominant feature. So those of you who have ever gone out and looked at a spruce tree or a pine tree, you probably noticed that the cones hang down from the branches. Some of them stand up, but they all come off the branches. So in this grouping, in the Oricariaceae, the cones all sit at the very tip of the branches. So look at this picture, you can see that those cones are what we call terminal on the branches. They are enormous. These are all female cones that you can see here. And you can see that they actually look spiky. Those are actually what are called pseudo leaves that are sitting underneath the scales on those cones. So very hard to mistake for anything else. It's a nice thing to see both in fossils and in the wild, because you can say to yourself, I know exactly what this is. We have those sexual structures, the female and male cones that follow those rules exactly. Now, to take us into our next Lazarus species, we have to look to Wallaby Park. So Wallaby Park is a national park in Australia located in the Blue Mountains, and it's just not too far outside Sydney. It's considered to be quite an accessible national park, used often by families, used for bushwalking, camping, canoeing, just scenic drives. It's got eucalypt forests, swamps, rainforests. It's a fairly diverse area. And back in 1994, 3 people were out hiking, rock climbing, and rappelling in this area within some of the more remote areas of the park. One of the individuals who was out looking, like just enjoying his day off, was actually a worker employed by New South Wales National Parks. And when they went into this particular canyon, this gentleman, David Noble, who was the one who worked for the National Parks and Wildlife Service, noticed a patch of trees that he couldn't identify. Like he'd been through the park many, many times. He wasn't sure what he was looking at. So before they left for the day, he took a few twigs and just stuck them in his backpack. And next time he was at work, he brought it out. Nobody else could ID them either. And eventually a team of botanists did come and visit the site and realized that what they were looking at was a new genus within this Oricariaceae family. So this is a group called the species is called the Wallaby Pine. So it's named after the national park. And you can see that the leaves might not look a lot like the monkey puzzle trees. They do share some of the same characteristics. But what really you can look at here is those cones. Those female cones, those big circular ones that are all spiky with those little tiny leaves, terminal on the branches, so they're at the very tip. And in this picture, you can actually see near the bottom left corner, there's actually a couple of male cones as well that are hanging down that are also terminal on the branch. So this was an incredible find. I think about, you know, what these plants lived through. Not this individual plant, but this species lived through, you know, the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs. It lived through at least 5 different ice ages. It lived through having flowering plants come and push them out. It lived through getting pushed into smaller and smaller and smaller spaces until ultimately we got to the point where we are at today, where only 3 small copses of this species are currently known. And there have been many, many, many surveys to go out and look for more. So we're pretty sure now that what we see is all that exists. So those 3 small copses that all occur within that same network of canyons in permanently moist pockets of rainforest. And to date, there are currently about 40 adult individuals with around 400 seedlings. And on top of that very small population number, genetic tests have actually shown us that there is no discernible genetic variation between individuals. So they're either clones or something very, very close to it. They have just lost all that genetic variation within the species. So because of those risk factors, they're also labeled as critically endangered, small population, at risk because of, mainly because of wildfires actually, as well as some fungal infections that they can be infected by. So the IUCN keeps them on the red list. And that isn't the last of the story for the Wallaby Pines. If you were following the news last year of the wildfires in Australia in the 2019 to 2020 fire season, this might have been where you have heard of this species. So the only known grove where the Wallaby Pine exists was saved through the catastrophic fires through incredible efforts of the firefighters. So in Wallaby National Park, over 90% of the park was destroyed by wildfires, but the single grove was saved through a combination of incredible efforts as well as setting up an irrigation system to keep the area moist. A lot of the plants have been scorched, but they think that they're going to regrow without any issues. And something that I always think about with this is, like, if those trees had died out, if that had been it, if they'd been wiped out, would our descendants, and you know, whether it's humans or whether it's anybody else 20 million years down the road, know that these trees had even still been here? With a small population like that, would there even have been a fossil record of the species existing beyond the point from 50 million years ago into today? It's hard to say. Now, that isn't the end of the story for the Wallaby Pines. So they are actually quite easy to cultivate, apparently. So they have been put in botanical gardens around the world. Got Tasmania there on the left, and then the Kew Gardens on the right. So they are out there. It's not that they only live in that one grove, but that is the only place where they could be found in the wild. So those are some fantastic stories. I've got 2 more species I want to talk about, and both of these species have actually been found during the coronavirus pandemic time. I already thought that my lockdown wasn't as productive as it could have been. Now I definitely know it wasn't, because I wasn't out there finding Lazarus species, but some people were. And one of the things that was found was this species here, the black-browed babbler. So this is obviously not a living example here. This is the only sample that was known to the world for 170 years. There was a single specimen that was collected sometime between 1843 and 1848. We're not quite sure because the expedition logs weren't great. They were collected by a guy who was doing expeditions within the Indonesian area named Carl Schwader. He collected this, sent it back to England, and it was identified and hadn't been seen since. Now, further surveys failed to detect this, this bird, and that led to the IUCN giving it a ranking about 5 years ago as data deficient. They knew it existed. We don't know. It's never been refound, no additional documentation. simply not enough information to say what was happening there. Now, part of the problem was that the original logs showed that the specimen had been located in Java, but subsequent follow-up led people to think that actually it was probably collected in Borneo. And as soon as that part was known, the real hunt was on. And what I really want to throw attention to here is that this species was not refound by biologists or conservationists who were employed by the government or anybody else going out to hunt for this bird. This was done by a bird watching group. So there is an Indonesian bird watching group whose mission is to reach out to local populations and people and teach them about diversity in their area. And two of the guys who doesn't sound like they were really into bird watching beforehand wanted to know what that bird was that they kept seeing around when they were outside. And in October of last year, in 2020, they did manage to live capture that specimen, took a picture of it, and sent it to one of the people who was listed as a local expert in that birding group. And he is a man by the name of Panji Gusti Akbar, and you can actually follow him on Instagram. His handle is Crazy Bird Guy, and he's got great photos. So he is a biologist and a bird guide who belonged to this birding network. And as soon as he saw those photos, he, by all accounts, he got super excited. And we have now this new record of the black-browed babbler for the first time in 170 years. It is much more beautiful when alive than dead. And you can see that now that it's actually been recaptured in its live form and it's been documented with images, that certain things are different, like the eye color is different, the plumage is more glossy. So hopefully as we move forward, this is something that can be recaptured and renoted, and we can have a better understanding of what this bird needs and what areas might need to be protected for it. Now, we're going to stay in the southern hemisphere, but go around a little bit to the other side of the world and go now to the Galapagos Islands. Specifically, we're going to be talking about Isla Fernandina, which is the westernmost of the Galapagos Islands. Some of you may have been there before. Of course, we know it as a the birthplace of evolution. It's an island chain where we have a lot of slightly differing species between the different islands. And one of the groups that is quite well known for is the Galapagos Tortoise complex. So this is a complex of what was 15 species, where those 15 species tended to be separated based on which island they lived on. There are 12 currently living species. We know that a few of them have gone extinct. And this is a great example. I mean, it's always held up as an example of evolution, but in some of the ways that we know that, for example, on islands with humid areas where there are highlands, the tortoises tend to be larger with high domed shells and short necks because they don't need to reach up for vegetation. On islands that are quite dry and have lowlands, the tortoises tend to be smaller, and they have what's called a saddleback, which I'll show you in the next photo, with very long necks. Now, tortoise numbers were at a high, we think, of around 250,000 across the island chain in the 16th century to a low of around 3,000 in the 1970s. And this was primarily caused by overexploitation of these species for meat and oil, as well as habitat clearance for agriculture, as well as introduction of non-native animals to the islands like rats and goats and pigs, which have devastated so many island flora. Now, the photo you're going to look at next, unfortunately, is an example of an extinct species. This one is not the good news species, because we know that tortoise populations on at least 3 islands have gone extinct in historical times, like within human records, because of human activities. This one here that you can see, you might know him by his name, Lonesome George. He was the last of the Pinta Island tortoises, and he did die in 2012 as the last member of his species. But let's look, like I said, at Isla Fernandina, which is the westernmost, and it's also the 3rd largest and the youngest of the Galapagos Islands. Like all of the Galapagos Islands, it was formed by volcanic activity as the Earth's crust has moved over a volcanic hotspot. And this is still an active volcano that has had at least 30 documented eruptions, including a whole bunch recently, 2020, 2018, 2017, 2009. And this island was known to be the home of the Fernandina giant tortoise. Now, this species was last seen in 1906. Since 1906, there have been multiple expeditions to go look for new individuals of the species, and there have been sightings of turtle poop and turtle bite marks on vegetation. There was an unconfirmed sighting around 12 years ago in 2009, but there was no verification of that individual. Now, this is an extremely harsh environment. It's got an active volcano. It's a very young landscape, low amounts of vegetation. And just to give you an idea of what kind of impacts volcanism has had, just in the past few years, we've seen a large amount of the island being affected by those volcanic eruptions. So the worry was that because of all these eruptions, even if there had been any individuals of the species left, that they probably didn't make it out of the way of the lava in time. However, it didn't stop people from going out and looking. It is a very, very difficult place to get to. It's very remote. It's hard to get ashore. Look at how difficult it would be to move across the surface of this island. Over 80% of it is barren lava. It's not just hard for tortoises to get around, it's also hard for biologists to get around. And people describe it as being just like a big rubble field. You fall in places, it's sharp, it's unstable, it's hard to walk in, hard to do biological surveys. But they did them and they found a tortoise. So in 2019, the Galapagos National Park Directorate, the Galapagos Conservancy, and as well as the TV show or TV network of Animal Planet did do an expedition out to the Fernandina Island and found a single tortoise. Now, at the time when this tortoise was found, she was found on the flank of the volcano, so thank goodness she was outside of that volcanic range, deep inside this really complex of shrubs. Initially, in 2019, they weren't sure whether or not this was actually an individual from the Fernandina Galapagos tortoise species, or whether it was possibly a tortoise from another island who had rafted over, and we had a reintroduction of tortoises to the island. But officially, as of 2020, let's go COVID. Like I said, there's been some good news. 2021, just this year, they did complete a genetic test on this individual and reference to that last collected specimen in 1906. And they did confirm that this individual is from the Fernandina Galapagos tortoise species. So not only have we refound this species, we've actually now refound a female of the species, which understandably is quite critical if we ever want to repopulate the species on the Fernandina Island. Now, interesting fact about tortoises, they don't know yet whether this particular individual is doing this, but female tortoises can actually store sperm within specialized structures in their reproductive system for possibly decades. So even if there was a male tortoise on the island 10, 20, 30 years ago, if those two individuals mated, she may actually still be storing sperm from a male. Now, she has since been transferred off Fernandina Island to the Galapagos Tortoise Breeding Center on Santa Cruz Island. So she is going to join the ranks of breeding tortoises. This breeding center, the goal is to breed and then reintroduce juveniles to the areas that they've been either extirpated from, or they just need to bump up population numbers. So we've all got our fingers really tightly crossed for this one, that we're seeing a species coming back that hasn't been seen for 115 years. And if we're really, really lucky, it may not just represent that single female, but we might possibly have kind of a de facto breeding pair if she still has those, any sperm stored. Now, as per IUCN, The Fernandina giant tortoise is still considered to be critically endangered for obvious reasons. There's only one of them that we know of, but the goal would be to hopefully start a breeding program, and when there's a set number of individuals, start reintroducing them to the island if at all possible. Now, I was so happy to come here and bring you these good news stories, and I want to end on what the implications of this for us are. And one of the main things that we always talk about in conservation biology is that we can't take those preservation and protection measures if we don't know that those species are there in the first place. And we all have parts to play. So these are just a couple of examples of species that have been refound to science. So many times these species are refound by people just like you and I, by people who are going out and bird watching, by people who are going out and looking at plants in their backyard or in their national park close to them. And no matter where you are in the world, I hope that you find time, or you make time, or you give it a chance to get out there and join some of these programs whose goal is to get people like all of us out there looking for these species, because the more eyes we have looking for them, the more of them we are going to find. And the more of them we can find, the more of them we can protect. And the US, you guys are doing fantastic. The latest numbers out was that fully 1 in 10 Americans have taken part in a citizen science activity within the past year. And I hope that we can keep this going. I hope that we can keep getting those species records out, and whether it's biology that makes you happy, whether you want to join a NASA project, there's so many different things that can all use our help. And not just the biologists, but we can be there and speak for the animals and the plants as well. And before I hand things back over to Ted for questions, I'll just give you this last little piece of good news here. So this plant that you can see here, it's a Coromia gigas, and it is native to Tanzania. It was refound about 2 years ago, and the flower that you can see here is the first time that this plant has flowered in a time that's been documented by humans. So this is in the Missouri Botanic Garden. Human eyes, no eyes of a living human had laid eyes on this flower until just this past year. So good news stories are still out there, and I hope you can all help us find more of them. Thank you.
Eleanor, that was fascinating. Thank you so much. What I just learned so much during this talk, and I can tell from the questions that are rolling in that lots of other people did too. Just a reminder to everybody that if you did have a question for Eleanor, please do type it into the questions panel within the GoToWebinar interface that you've got on your computer. I do apologize that we aren't going to have time to go through all of these questions today, but let's do a couple of them here. You know, one question that's kind of come up in a few different from a few different of our listeners is whether or not there is work being done with sort of advanced scientific cell culture techniques to bring back some of these species that may have gone extinct, or maybe they've gone extinct and come back, but now they're close to dying off again. And like, are there any ways that we're able to further that type of scientific work?
Oh, that's one of my favorite questions, Ted, because I'm on Team Mammoth. If we can get like mammoths back in North America, I will be a very, very happy individual. And this is one of the things that often comes up as, if we were to bring back any one species, what would you pick, and what are your reasons for it? And in many biologists, we are looking primarily to preserve and protect species that have a good chance of still having enough of their habitat left and enough wilderness left that if any further protection measures are needed, they are doable, right? So let's say, for example, with the Fernandina Islands, let's say that the entirety of the island had just blown up in a huge volcanic eruption, and we still had a single tortoise. At that point, would there be any point in reintroducing that species to a habitat that no longer existed? And this is a huge debate about what the best things are and how we can best allocate resources to conservation science, because we know that there's only so much money and so much time and so much willingness. So the focus is really on those animals and plants and organisms that have enough of their habitat left that they will survive after reintroduction. And so far, the ethics committees have not yet approved bringing a species back that has already gone extinct, which is why I will probably never see a mammoth for real in my lifetime. But species that have a small number of individuals, they are certainly working on things like breeding programs to increase genetic diversity, to focus on those organisms that are still here with us, that do have a chance of survival, that don't need Jurassic Park technology to bring back those animals.
That was also an excellent answer. Thank you for clarifying that for us. So quite a few questions related to the Galapagos tortoise. Really fascinating scenario that you laid out there. I can't believe that these tortoises can store sperm for many years at a time. I've never heard of such a thing. One question that came up is you mentioned how the tortoise had been moved from one island to the next to the breeding center, and is the concept that under this close observation, or that there may be more opportunities for her to lay those eggs, or to undergo the reproductive process? What is the movement of her to another island intended to do?
That's also a great question. And primarily the reason that we see captive breeding programs being an important part of species conservation measures is because for any species that's out there in the wild, they have a number of different things that they need to have happen right for them to have a chance of breeding, right? You need to have access to a mate. You need to have adequate numbers of resources. So for females, that usually means, lots of calories, extra body fats, whatever that might be. And you need to have the correct habitats to, if you're a tortoise, lay your eggs and have them not be predated, for example. So for moving the tortoise in particular, we're looking to get her into that artificial habitat where she's always got the right temperature, she's always got enough food, she's always got a habitat where if she does lay eggs, that there's zero chance of predators coming in to get them, that if those eggs hatch, that again, none of those juveniles would be lost to predators either. So tortoises and turtles are quite notorious for high levels of loss in those juvenile stages. And if you can keep them in a controlled area, instead of having 1 or 2 or 10% of those hatchlings reach maturity, you might get to a position where you've got instead 90 to 100% of those juveniles reaching maturity and then becoming potential breeders as well. So it's I was going to say quick and easy. It's not quick and it's not easy, but it's a way of really increasing the chances of the survival of the next generation.
Excellent. One related question, it's sort of prior to the survival of that next generation. Do you know what would encourage the female to have the young if they've been storing that sperm for many years? Like, are there certain conditions that can be laid out that may encourage it, or is it simply a waiting game?
Well, that's going to be the million-dollar question, right? Because this particular individual belongs to a species that hasn't been seen since 1906. And before 1906, the main reason people visited the island was to catch and kill turtles, not to focus on what conditions were correct for the breeding of these tortoises. So the experts who work at the Galapagos Tortoise Breeding Center are going to bring their best practices and knowledge about what's worked for the other species to hopefully also have it work for the Fernandina Island species. And if that doesn't work, I imagine that they're going to start tweaking some of those scenarios to see whether or not any changes to that will result in a habitat and situation where she feels comfortable and able to lay eggs.
All right. Thank you. Well, I am going to finish us off here with one earlier question that somebody asked. It's a little bit of a more big picture question. Do we know of a species that may have evolved into a new species and by result no longer exists? And if not, would this even be possible?
Ah, yes, evolutionary trees for sure. So a species that exists and then evolves into another species, and that initial species ceases to exist. And in fact, yes, we see many, many examples of this within the fossil record, and we could even pick humans as an example. We know that, and I'm going to have to drag out some old knowledge here, but the species of human that we are and Neanderthal humans shared a common ancestor. In fact, to the point where there was crossbreeding early on in the time of separation. Now, Neanderthals, of course, no longer exist. The earlier forms of human also no longer exist because they have been supplanted by modern humans. We were just more successful, and the other species were not able to compete with us. So within both the fossil record and even within human history, we can see examples of this. Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands are great examples of what people like to bring up when we talk about plasticity of features and that very fast-moving evolution, because the finches have differently shaped beaks that are related to what kind of food they eat. And if I were to take, for example, a breeding pair of finches out of the wild into the lab and start feeding them only hard seeds instead of soft fruit, we would actually see their descendants change shape in their beak to adapt to that kind of food that they're now eating. And this, we could talk about, Lazarus species forever because there's so many examples of them. These finches actually re-evolved themselves to fill a hole that had been left. So we actually know a finch that went extinct. The island was then colonized by finches from a different island, and because those same conditions still existed, the finch re-evolved, and we got that same species back again, even though they were only distantly related to that first batch that we had that had gone extinct. So they are such big picture questions, and this is really where I want a whiteboard to start drawing lines and connecting things up. But evolution is a funny thing is the short answer to that. And whatever you think can possibly happen probably has happened at least multiple times.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to wrap it up here. I apologize, there are more questions that we haven't had a chance to get to, but we're already over by a few minutes. I want to take a moment here to thank everybody who joined us today and for the thoughtful questions and enthusiastic feedback that they're sharing for your wonderful presentation. And of course, Eleanor, I'm very grateful for your time and expertise and taking us through this journey of some fascinating things that are happening here in our world. So just a reminder to everyone that the replay will be available on our website soon, and you'll get an email with that replay sent to you automatically. By all means, please join us. We've got some more great presentations later this week. And with that, I'm going to conclude the webinar. Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, everybody. I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Ted. Thanks, everybody.